Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast, where my guest for this episode is Professor Paul Seabright, talking about his book, The Divine Economy. Before we get onto that, though, just a couple of messages from me. Firstly, you can now book tutoring sessions for the Sociology Show podcast with myself via the Calendly website. So if you go to calendly.com/sociology show tutoring. There you can see which sessions are available and whether you want a 1 hour slot, an hour and a half, 2 hours, whether you want a single lesson or multiple lessons, then you can book yourself in for some online tutoring there. The Sociology Show podcast is also offering a course called Head Start Sociology, and this will be delivered towards the end of August and the start of September 2024. So if you are a student yourself about to start sociology A-level or GCSE, or perhaps you are a school or college and you've got some new students coming through and you'd like them to get a little bit of a head start to find out what sociology is all about, where the term comes from, who defined it, what you're going to study, the very basics of sociology, then you can sign up for that conference. And again, you can book your slot on the Calendly website. Okay. And that is, I'll give you that address again. That's calendly.com/sociology show tutoring. Thank you very much for listening to the messages. Without further ado, let's go over to the interview with Professor Paul Seabright. Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. Would you like to start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do, please?
Well, thank you for this invitation. It's great to be here. So my name's Paul Seabright. I teach economics at the Toulouse School of Economics in Toulouse, France. And I'm a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, which is an interdisciplinary research center. So I actually spend a lot of my time hanging out with people who are not economists like me. These are people who will be sociologists, anthropologists, historians, lawyers, psychologists. And so I'm very, very comfortable in this interdisciplinary environment. And what I study mainly is what you might think of as at the intersection between behavioral economics and the economics of institutions. Or to put it in a simple way, it's where our prehistoric brain meets the modern world.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we're going to talk about your book, which I've got here. I'll read the full title for everyone: The Divine Economy, How Religions Compete for Wealth, Power and People. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, Paul, is actually that the first bit, the first story, the story of grace, I think sets up the book for where it's going to go, its direction. So I wondered if you could outline the story of grace to start with, because I think that really sets up the narrative nicely.
Well, thank you. I mean, Grace was a woman who made a lot of impression on me. I met her when I was in Ghana with my team of researchers playing economic games with a large number of people who were all members of a Pentecostal church in Ghana. And we played these games not in the church because we didn't want that to bias their answers. We chose a neutral setting in a secular university building. And Grace was one of the people who came to our experiments. And after the experiments, there was also a detailed questionnaire and debriefing. And I did that with her. And she was about 24 years old. And looking at her, she was sort of simply but well dressed, and spoke carefully and thoughtfully. And looking at her, I thought I could pretty much size her up. I thought she was probably somebody with a reasonable, at least high school education, and that she probably worked as a clerk in a government office or maybe a small business somewhere. But I could not have been more wrong. 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, she walks up and down between the lines of cars coming in on one of the main freeways into Accra, and they block up at the traffic lights, and she goes up and down trying to sell them iced water in little plastic sachets in a basket above her head. And you just have to imagine what it's like doing that, inhaling the exhaust fumes, being insulted and abused by the people in the cars. And she does that 12 hours a day. She goes home to this tiny little shack that she's built with her aunt in a slum area. But on Sundays, she goes to church and she can dress reasonably well. She's an usher, so she shows people to her seat and is quite visible to them. Um, she sings in the choir. She's a helper in a Sunday school, and we worked out that she gives about 12% of her income to the church. And when I say to the church, I mean you have to see what the church is, but important who it is. I mean, the boss of her church, who is the beneficiary of a large amount of this income, is a very charming man. I call him Pastor William in the book, and he wears a very fine suit. He drives a fast Mercedes. He's very happy that everybody should know that he's rich. In fact, he has a buckle around his belt with a dollar sign on it. And he doesn't need her money, but she gives it to him, and she gives it to him not only willingly, but I would say lucidly. We had a long discussion of her finances, and she can give you a better and more lucid account of her finances than I can of mine. Um, and she knows perfectly well that if she gives money to him, she can't pay for health care for her aunt and so on. And so a lot of the book is based around this question of why is she doing this? And the answer you can't give is she's not stupid, she's not deceived, she's not in an ordinary sense exploited. I mean, you might have a complicated theory of how she's exploited, but she's not a victim. On the contrary, she's a real victim 6 days a week in her awful job. But one day a week, she doesn't sound like a victim. She doesn't talk like a victim. She doesn't walk like a victim. And I wanted to tell her story in a way that didn't just make her out to be a victim.
Yeah. But as soon as I read that, my initial thought was, and I don't know if you can put any numbers on this, but of the 8 billion people on Earth, the vast majority are religious in some form. A large number of those pay around 10% of their salary towards religion. So, I mean, could we even put an estimate on what percentage of the world is paying some form of money into their faith?
Well, of the world as a whole, that would be hard. But I did report in the book that a conservative estimate of the financial revenues of faith-based organizations in the United States amounts to about 2% of personal income. And I gave reasons for thinking that it's rather similar in a number of countries where Pentecostal Christianity is a very powerful force, like many countries in Africa and a number of in Asia and Latin America. Now, to give it some perspective, 2% of personal income in the United States is about 60% of the income of all of the media and public publishing industries. So, video games, recorded music, movies, books, the lot. 60% of that. And it's about half of the income of all the restaurant industry in the United States. So this is quite big money.
Wow.
Now, there are not many countries, I would say, where the total revenues are higher than that, but there are quite a lot of countries where they're equivalent. And that's a lot of money. That's enough to buy quite a lot of very rich pastors some choice real estate in the finest areas of the cities in which they live. So that doesn't even include all of the contributions in time and energy and in kind. So whether you like them, whether you don't, religious movements are economically very powerful and they're worth studying, if only for that reason alone. But of course, in the book, I always also talk about their power, about the good things they do with their power, and some of the bad things they do with their power. And I think we are all better off if we can understand where that power comes from and how it's exercised.
Thank you. I could be completely out of touch here as well, but is it still true that major religions, don't have to pay taxes? They are a charity. So is that still true?
It varies from country to country. In the United States, in particular, on which I concentrate in the book, they not only pay no taxes, as is the case in the vast majority of countries in the world, but they also don't have to publish any accounts, or indeed to give any account to anybody about what they do. So you or I could set up a church together in the United States. I mean, I don't know if you ever get bored of making podcasts, and I get bored of what I do. Maybe we can go into this together. But we could literally open a storefront in a street in the United States, and we ask people to give us money. And unlike in almost all other circumstances, where if we get money from the public, we have to declare ourselves to be a business or a charity and explain why we don't have to pay personal income tax on that. You or I could do that. We would have to pay no tax on it at all, unless the IRS decides to investigate us, which they might, of course, if they've listened to the podcast and they know that this is a scam and so on. But the IRS has a lot on its plate, and it's not normally going to investigate it if we put a little sign outside saying we're the such and such church of such and such. And so that's a very unusual thing, because most charities are exempt from paying tax. Again, I'm talking about the US, provided that they publish accounts and they in some sense declare themselves as charities and conform to the rules on charities. Now, in other countries, it's not always the same, but there are even countries, I think 9 of them in Europe, where not only do they pay no tax, but the government collects taxes on their behalf. So, for example, if you're a citizen of Germany, you have a space on your tax return in which you can choose to pay a proportion of your taxes to one of the designated churches. And in Iceland, which is ahead of the curve on many things, they actually have this same thing, that you can raise money for the churches. But of course, it's not just the traditional churches that are eligible. So there is a church in Iceland whose name I've forgotten, but which is a church that is open only to atheists who disapprove of paying taxes. And so they have exploited this particular feature of the tax code in Iceland. But in the other 8 countries in Europe, you have to be in some sense, a registered established church to do that. And so the church not only is being obliged to pay taxes to the government, but the government is actually raising taxes on behalf of the church.
Interesting. You just really got me scratching my head then, thinking, can atheists form a religion? Anyway, I digress. Does that mean then, if you said there's no obligation to declare, that we don't actually have any idea how much money is in, for example, the Catholic Church or Scientology or whatever it may be? We have no understanding at all what the wealth is there?
Well, I mean, a number of very professional and dedicated researchers and journalists have tried to find this out. And I think The Economist published an estimate of the incomes of the Catholic Church in the United States. I've forgotten what it was. It's obviously some subset of that 2% of personal income number I gave you. But they're very difficult. I mean, there's the important point to bear in mind is that if you study organized religion, there's no central place you can go to get statistics in the same way that you can go to the official statistical agencies of each country to get statistics on incorporated businesses, because it's part of the deal, if you're an incorporated business, that you say, well, okay, in order for the people who founded the business not to have to pay personal income tax on every dollar of revenue that they get, which of course is great for them if they don't have to pay income tax on that, but they then have an obligation to follow certain rules. And notably, these rules involve an important degree of transparency about what they're earning. And, we all know corporate accounting scandals and so on, they're a big deal. But the point is, the fact that there are corporate accounting scandals show that there are rules that corporations have to obey. Whereas in the United States, there essentially are no rules that churches have to obey, providing they are properly considered churches. And from time to time, the IRS does a swoop, but usually because they've had a tip-off. Without a tip-off, it's very rare that they do swoops.
Thank you. And the next part of the book that I wanted to pick up on was for students listening who are studying sociology. A big part of the beliefs topic is this idea of secularization. That secularization is occurring and it's sweeping across not just the US and the UK, but other parts of the world. Your research suggests something quite different, that we are not experiencing a worldwide secularization process at all. That actually religion is alive and well. Is that a fair point to make?
Well, let me first of all say that secularization has lots of different meanings. It's used in very different ways. And I think that if you look at some of the very early writers on secularization, people like Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, they were talking about the way in which the arrival of modernity, which they described in various different ways, would change the nature of religion. And it might be seen as putting religion on the back foot, but I think neither Durkheim or Weber ever really thought that religion would be incapable of responding.
Mm.
Now, over time, the secularization hypothesis has become transformed. And there are lots of very fine sociologists writing about it who don't do this, but there are some who have transformed it into the doctrine that religion was going to disappear. In other words, it's not just that religion's under pressure from all sorts of things, including modern science, urbanization, and so forth, but also that religion was incapable of responding and would therefore wither away. Now, my target in the book is the people who think that. It's just not true that religion is withering away. It is declining in importance in a number of parts of the world, of which North America is probably the most important example, and I discuss in the book some reasons why, and parts of Western Europe. But across the world as a whole, those regions are outliers. In the rest of the world, in large parts of it, Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia, many parts of Latin America, religion is thriving. The story is different. I mean, there are parts of Latin America where it's declining. Chile is a good example. There are many parts of Europe where it's declining. I discuss the cases of Ireland and Spain in a number of respects. But if you take the world as a whole, essentially, there's some ups, there's some downs, but religion is not dying out. And I think that we should assume that it's here to stay. But that doesn't mean that it's unchanging. On the contrary, it's adapting. It's adapting to those challenges of the modern world. And what the book is about is how it's adapting and precisely why, in the face of some challenges that some people have thought would be fatal to religion, it's actually able to reform, reshape, and speak to the needs that many, many people, billions of people, in fact, across the world have, which the other institutions of modern secular society are not very good at meeting.
Yeah, and I suppose that kind of brings on to the next question that I was going to ask about part two of your book is how do religions gain their power? So I wondered if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit more about that, because it's interesting, going back to what you said about Grace. It's she wasn't being duped. This was um, her giving her money over through her own free will. So I wondered what other examples you had of how religions gain their power in that section that you write about.
Okay, well, I mean, there are lots. I draw lots of cases. I draw them from India. I draw them from Cameroon in West Africa. I draw them from China. I draw them from, well, many, many different places, and also many historical examples as well. And so the central organizing idea in the book is that we can understand why religions have become powerful if we understand them as platforms. Now, what are platforms? We're used to thinking of platforms as these digital entities like Facebook and Google and so on. And they are platforms. But what's interesting is that what makes them platforms is nothing to do with being digital or being modern or even being huge. What a platform is an organization that brings people together to make a community. Okay. Now, that's obviously what Facebook does, and it's obviously what Google does, and it's obviously what many, many digital platforms do. But the type of community varies, and you don't have to have digital technology to do it. So if you think of, in prehistoric times, there were matchmakers in villages and towns that would bring people together to make marriages. There were interpreters who helped people who spoke different languages to join together. There were marketplaces which brought together sellers and buyers. All of these are platforms. And what religions do is essentially they create communities. And sometimes they're very transient, short-term communities. So you might have just a religious movement, which is a shrine by the side of the road. And for a while, it brings together people who maybe are united in their reverence for the origin of the shrine. But sometimes it's just a huge movement around the world, like the Catholic Church. And sometimes it's intermediate. So you can have movements within the Catholic Church, like the Jesuits, or you can have movements within Protestantism, like, say, the Assemblies of God, which was the Pentecostal movement, which is a kind of brand of an American Pentecostal church, which has since spread out across the world and which creates communities. And the point is that because creating communities allows people to come together in ways that they wouldn't have been able to do so otherwise, that creates benefits. And the basic business model of those platforms is that they appropriate a share of the benefits that those relationships create.
Thank you. And it's really interesting, like the language you say, that the business model. Do you think many religions do see themselves as a business? In the same way that you'd have a business meeting, business plan, looking at income, outgoings, and so on. You think they see themselves as a business in that respect?
Absolutely. And it's important to make it clear that I'm not saying that people who found or people who run religious movements are necessarily motivated by profit or the desire for money. I mean, some are. Let's be frank about it. Some are absolutely motivated by the wish to earn money. Pastor William in Accra is one such person. He absolutely gloried in it. But many people who run religious movements are not motivated by that. They're motivated by something else. They may be motivated by the genuine desire to do good for the downtrodden, or they may be motivated by the desire to show off and be admired in a community of people who all think that they represent the word of God. Or they may be motivated because they have a hyperactive libido and they can indulge it in these movements, and there are people who do. The point is, I'm neutral about why they do it. There are all sorts of motives. The important point that they all share is that they have to command enough resources to keep the show on the road, otherwise their movement will disappear. And sometimes if you have a very modest movement, if all you want to do is to tend a roadside shrine, then your costs aren't very high, but your revenues aren't going to be very high either. You maybe can persuade a few people to light a candle at the shrine, and you don't need much revenue to cover your costs. If, on the other hand, you want to have a very big modern church with a whole team of pastors and the latest in audiovisual technology, and visiting musicians from across the world, and a private jet, and all of the things that some religious movements leaders have wanted to do, then you've got to have some pretty big revenues. And the point is that however you pitch your ambitions, you've got to manage the flow of revenues and the flow of outgoings in such a way that you can keep that model going.
Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
And I'd like to tap back into what we were saying about the grace scenario, if you like, to start with, because that makes perfect sense. If people are paying almost like a subscription, a monthly subscription or whatever, to be part of a community makes perfect sense. But in particular, tapping into those that are really, really poor, like you said, the example of grace. I find it amazing that someone would pay 10% of not a lot, when they could be using, or they need that money for something else. So I just wonder how that hook works, to tap into the poorest of markets, if you like.
I wondered about that too, but you only have to talk to her for a while, and you only have to try to imagine the sheer awfulness of her daily work to understand why having one day a week in which she can put on a clean dress, she can go into a community that respects her, that treats her well, that listens to her with respect and honor, which gives her the opportunity to be responsible for some younger people who are even more vulnerable than she is. I mean, that's really important.
Yeah.
And one of the things I say in the book, that one of the things that I think many of these platforms have understood, which people, particularly coming from my background as an economist, often have difficulty getting, is that the ability to contribute to a community is something that people value. I quote St. Paul as saying, it's better to give than to receive. Now, I'm not in the habit of quoting St. Paul a lot in my everyday life, but I can tell you that that particular thing is worth meditating on, because economically minded people often think that it's a kind of injunction. It sort of says, we're all selfish, but actually it would be better for us all if we gave something to the community. I don't think that's what that means at all. I think what it means is we are more truly ourselves when we give than when we passively receive others. And there's a wealth of evidence from sociology and from anthropology. It's exactly like that. what is it about being unemployed that makes people so miserable? It's not that they can't afford the latest iPhone. It's that they can no longer make a contribution to their families, to their friends. They can no longer be contributors to the collective activities they engage with their friends. And that's deeply hurtful to them. So what I think a lot of these communities do is that they understand that allowing people to contribute, sure, I mean, sometimes they can't contribute very much money, but they do contribute money, but they also contribute time and energy and effort. And that's, depending on how you tell it, is both a very empathetic response to people's psychological makeup and a very good business model. And I guess the uncomfortable truth that I'm putting forward in the book is that it can be both things at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking, like the optimist in me, that makes perfect sense, in terms of Grace's story. The pessimist worries in me that is there an element of fear, that so if, for example, a particular person feels that if they didn't pay it, they might have less opportunity to get into heaven or to please God or something like that. I just wonder if it also hinges on the fear of the unknown as well.
Potentially, absolutely, yes. Now, I think the first thing to say though is that when I started working on this, which was quite a long time ago, I was looking for the answer to what is religiosity.
Mm.
And the answer to that is there is no such thing as religiosity. Religiosity is an incredibly complex, multifaceted thing. We have a very diverse and varied psychology, and we apply it to our interactions with religion in lots of ways. So if you ask what's the religiosity of a medieval crusader, it's a completely different thing than what's the religiosity of an Indian nun. And it doesn't it's not helpful to look for the answer to what religiosity is. So if that's true, then it will certainly be true that some people in their interaction with their religious communities have a strong element of fear.
Mm.
And that I think is both unsurprising and not intrinsically worrying. After all, we're all of us in, I don't want to make a fool of myself on your podcast. I don't want to be ridiculed by my colleagues. A certain amount, it's not a fear that I spend a lot of time awake at night worrying about, but I'd be not human if I didn't have some fear about some things. And so it's not necessarily bad that that's present in religious communities. What it does do, though, is it creates opportunities for abuse. If somebody, knowing that they can work on your fear to try to manipulate you into doing something that's not in their interest but is in yours, then you as a religious leader carry an awesome responsibility. And paradoxically, you have that power over people because you've earned their trust before. And again, that I want to sort of raise the uncomfortable truth that abusers who exist in religious communities, as they exist in many other communities, are not just sort of bad people who have unaccountably got our trust for no reason. They're often people who earned our trust by things that they did to earn it, and who, as a result, have found themselves with an ability to exploit vulnerabilities in others, which they then are unable to resist the temptation to exploit.
Thank you. And that kind of links to the third part of your book, religion and the uses of power. There's a section in there that I thought we could explore just a little bit more, if you don't mind. The great religion gender gap.
Yeah.
As I said, students who study beliefs look quite a lot about the link between religion and gender. So do you mind just telling us a little bit about that part of the book, please?
Sure. Well, I start with the paradox that if you try to look at sort of global statistics on religiosity, you get this apparent finding that women are more religious than men on average. Again, it's not massive, the difference, but I think at the global level, it's something like the difference between 79% of men globally declare that they belong to a religion and 84% of women. Okay. Now, so then there's been a whole lot of ink spilled over what makes women more religious than men. And to be honest, I don't think it's a terribly interesting question because, first of all, what we see is that, as I mentioned, religiosity is a bunch of very different things. So if we had been conducting surveys of religiosity in, say, the 14th century, when the crusade against the Cathars was taking place in my region of southwest France, then you would probably have said that being religious includes being willing to engage in very violent acts against people you consider to be heretics. And surprise, surprise, that tends to skew rather masculine as a personality trait. I won't speculate why, but it does. And we don't ask questions like that anymore in surveys of religiosity. We ask about things like, how often do you pray, and things like that. And it turns out that those questions that tend to be asked in surveys of religiosity about religious behavior and so on tend to skew somewhat female, but only really for the Christian world. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, which I discuss, and which go right back to the dawn of Christianity. So one of the things to remember is that very unusually, the Christian religion spread in the Roman world disproportionately among slaves and women compared to men. And among the reasons for that seems to be the fact that the adult male pre-Roman was pretty much the emperor of his own household. So he might be rather low in the pecking order in Roman society, but he was basically the emperor of everything that went on behind closed doors with him. And that meant that there was essentially nothing that either law or ethics could do to constrain him from treating his wife, his children, his mistresses, his slaves of both genders in any way he wanted. And the result was, massive abuse of all kinds: physical, sexual, psychological, financial abuse of the vulnerable in the Roman world. And into this world comes this, at the time, a very small cult grown up around somebody who had been martyred, and whose supporters and disciples said, we are preaching a message that is universal. It's for everybody. And guess what? It constrains men as well as women. It says, sure, there are some restrictions on personal behavior, including sexual behavior, including treatment of the weak, and they constrain the men. And that, for Roman morality, that was quite new, absolutely new. Now, you can ask a similar question about modern conditions. So many people have said to me, what I can't really understand is, why is it that, for example, these very conservative ethics of personal behavior and these very patriarchal notions of the family and so on seem to be so popular in evangelical churches, Pentecostal churches, and so on in the United States and elsewhere? Why is it that so many women are buying into this very patriarchal set of values? And I don't think, if you look at the detail of it, it's that surprising, because although the Christian message for personal responsibility, for family ethics and so on, appears to be very much loaded in favor of the privileges of the male, it comes with a lot of talk about the duties of the male. And, when you're in communities where many males are absent dads, or, they're not doing their bit in the family, having somebody who's telling you, sure, the female is subordinate, but she's subordinate to somebody who has to earn her respect by, contributing both money, energy, work, and moral example to the family unit. That's not a message that all women are unhappy to hear. Many of them are very pleased to hear that the ethics of family responsibility work in both directions. They work they constrain men as well as constraining women. Now, okay, it's not the kind of perfectly symmetric ideal that many secular people in the modern world would like to hear, but compared to some of the alternatives in some of the communities in which those religious movements are popular, it's a big improvement. And so I think we need to understand what the communities do is speaking to women and speaking to their needs, and in particular their needs for a kind of contract between men and women in families that very few secular institutions are providing for them.
Thank you. And it kind of links to what I wanted to conclude with, actually, because, obviously towards the end of the book, you start to think about the future of religion and where it's going. And I did wonder if there is kind of a movement back towards more fundamental values, more conservative values in many parts of the world. So, where do you see it going, Paul?
Well, I talk in the book about how dangerous it is to project
Yes.
current trends in the future. But I do say that understanding current trends does help us a lot. And obviously, one of the reasons why religion remains very, very popular in the world, in spite of the advances of modern science, doesn't have anything to do with sort of people foolishly not caring about modern science. I give an example in the book in which I talk about how the anthropologist Raymond Firth talked about the complex, busy world of gods in the community of the Tikopian Islanders in the Pacific. And the idea that there's a god for everything, so that if you have a canoe and you want to repair it, you have to get the god of the tool with which you're going to repair the canoe to move into the canoe. And in order to do that, the eel god who previously resided in the canoe has to leave. Right. Now, when I say that the traditional doctrine of secularization is missing something important, I'm not denying that most people nowadays would not go to somebody who can command the eel god when they want to repair a piece of transport equipment. I mean, you go to an engineer or to a mechanic, and in that sense, there's absolutely no question about the fact that a scientific and in some ways mechanical view of the world and of causality has displaced the view of the world that was much more common, in which kind of everything happened because there was some god that was making it happen. So nobody's disputing secularization in that way. What's mistaken, I think, is to conclude from that religion's on the back foot and it has nothing better to offer. And instead, what is happening is what you alluded to in your question, I think, which is that religions are offering a bundle of important services that people want, and they want them in a package that help them to make sense of this bewildering mix of activities, which is the modern world. I mean, you know, in a big city, you have to find work, you have to find a place to live, you have somehow or other to, if you have children, you have to bring up your children, you have to protect them from the risks, and you know, in the modern world, it can feel like you're doing all of this stuff by yourself. You're having to reinvent the entire wheel of modern life over and over again. And you do this and your kids invent it over and over again. And the great appeal of many of these religious movements is that they come with a kind of package deal that says, okay, we care about the education of your kids. We care about your ability to make music. We care about your sickness. We care about your ability to engage in fun activities together as a family at a weekend. And we also offer you a narrative that tells you how this all fits together, including, you know, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why does so many things go badly, even though we desperately and sincerely and honestly pray for them to come right? Now, some people are more convinced by those narratives than others are, and I make no secret of the fact early in the book that by and large I'm not convinced by them. But the point is somebody is making them, and many of the institutions of the secular institutions of the modern world are not even trying to make them.
Yeah, it's kind of, you mentioned in the book Pascal's wager, don't you? If you're hovering and you're agnostic, does it make sense to be slightly more on the side of believing than not?
Yeah. Except as I point out in the book, you don't have one belief option, you have many belief options, and Pascal's wager is actually no help there. But I'll encourage your readers who are interested in belief to go to that chapter on belief. But I think what's really important is that most people don't join religious movements because they've become convinced in advance of the truth of the religion's doctrines. They become convinced of the truth of the religion's doctrines typically after they've joined. It's a process. And I talk about why that is and why that makes sense in terms of what we know about human psychology. And for some people, belief in terms of the truth of the doctrines is really, really important. But for a lot of people, we have to accept it's not very important. And what I think has been the strength, the economic strength of religious movements is that they can unite around a common project people who have amazingly sophisticated beliefs and people who have really very few, and they can still feel they're part of a project together.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. At that point, I thought this might be a good opportunity for you to say a little bit more. You just mentioned if students want to find out more about the book. Do you want to give us some details or how they could get in contact with you as well?
Well, I mean, they can Google me. Or I have a website, which is paulseabright.com. The book itself is available through most of the outlets. I don't think I'm allowed to. Well, I would not wish to.
We know which ones, yeah.
Yeah, you know which outlets. And I'm very, very happy to take comments and discussions from anybody. You'll find how to get in contact with me from my personal webpage. And I welcome discussions from anybody, including people who dislike the book as well as people who like it. As I said before, I'd want to emphasize that it's not a book either that defends or attacks religion. I'm just not into that game. Okay. There are many books that are angrily attacking religion or angrily defending it against attacks. That's not what this book is about. This book is about trying to understand how it functions. And I believe there's a common language that we can all use, whether we're Christians or atheists or Muslims or Buddhists or whoever. Sometimes people say to me, well, I don't understand how you, who's not a Christian, could possibly understand what religion is for me as a Christian. And I understand where they're coming from, but it's also true that by that logic, if you're a Christian, say you're a Catholic, you would say, well, I can't understand why a Protestant would understand my belief. And so if a Protestant can't understand them, I would say, well, maybe the wrong kind of Catholic couldn't understand them. And so once you start thinking that somebody who doesn't share your particular beliefs can't understand you, then you're going down a rabbit hole in which, in a sense, nobody can understand you because your beliefs turn out to be very, very particular to you. I want to tell a story about religion in which we can all share some basic elements of what is it that religious movements do, whatever set of particular theological beliefs we may attach to that process.
Thank you, Paul. That sounds like a lovely way to wrap up the interview. So I want to thank you for your time. I really do appreciate it. And thank you for answering the question so eloquently for me as well.
Thank you for inviting me to speak to your community of listeners. And as I say, I really enjoy getting feedback from listeners. And so I'd encourage anybody who wants to do that to write to me. Sometimes I don't reply instantly, so be patient. But I'd love to hear from any of you who have any thoughts or questions or comments to make.
Perfect. Thanks again, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.